Simelang Absheni Ralocha Sanbonani Mulweni. My name is Naledi Mfoloe, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the latest edition of the African Diaspora News channel, where we unravel the stories that shape our world and our community. Now, let's talk about a major betrayal, right? A true hidden history that many of us might not even know about, right? Now, the US government blocked a $1 billion donation from Muammar Gaddafi to Black people in the United States. Yes, that's right. A $1 billion donation to help the Black communities was blocked simply because of political interest and racial power dynamics. Now let that sink in. Now, for context, right, this goes back to 1996 when Louis Farghana, the head of the Nation of Islam, made a request for financial aid from Gaddafi, a man who had been seen as outspoken about his support for African liberation, right? Now, Gaddafi saw Black Americans as a part of the global African family, and he wanted to help and to build up the community that historically had been denied resources and opportunities. Now, Farah Khan, who recognized the potential of such a donation, applied for it. But here's where it gets really ugly. Because the United States Department under the Clinton administration rejected it, claiming that Gaddafi was a dangerous figure who was allegedly funding terrorism. Now, let's pause for a second, because they blocked $1 million for Black Americans in need, claiming that Gaddafi was dangerous. But here's the truth they never tell you, because the real reason was never about terrorism. It was always about power. It was always about control, because Gaddafi was a man who had the audacity to challenge Western supremacy, to stand up against colonial powers that had historically oppressed Africans across the world. And what did they do? They smeared his name, painted him as a villain, and ultimately, as we know, led the charge in destroying Libya. But here's the most enraging part. The US was okay with blocking money for Black Americans, but let's not forget the role that they played in destabilizing Africa for centuries. I mean, they fine, right, with funding wars in Africa and arming dictators and turning entire nations into failed states. But the minute an African leader like Gaddafi tries to help his people, tries to help Black Americans specifically, they throw up roadblocks. And what's the real result? They don't care about terrorism. They cared about their control. They knew that if African leaders, especially one like Gaddafi, were able to give economic power and independence to Black people, then it would upset their centuries-old dominance. And let's be clear about this, because Gaddafi was the only leader at the time putting his money where his mouth was when it came to supporting Black people globally. I mean, he spoke out against the exploitation of Africa and called for the end of Western-backed oppression, and was actually willing to put billions into African development and Black empowerment. And what did the US do? They shut it down, just as they shut down everything that could help uplift Black people, both in the US and in the diaspora. Let's have a look at this.
The real evil in America is not white flesh or black flesh. The real evil in America is the idea that undergirds the setup of the Western world. And that idea is called white supremacy.
Then Farrakhan talked directly to President Clinton.
We are a wounded people, but we're being healed. But President Clinton, America is also wounded. And there's hostility now in the great divide between the people. Socially, the fabric of America is being torn apart. And it's black against black, black against white, white against white, white against black, yellow against brown, brown against yellow. We are being torn apart.
Now, I want you to pay close attention to this next clip. Let's watch.
Farhan had requested an exemption from sanctions on Libya. The money was to help poor Black people suffering under a new US welfare law. It was also to be used to fund voter registration drives and the economic development of Black communities. Farhan was also supposed to receive a $250,000 humanitarian award from Gaddafi, but the US blocked that as well. Washington insisted that Gaddafi had sinister intentions in promoting the interests of Black people in the United States. We understand why the US felt threatened by the once uniquely thriving African country under Gaddafi. Libya had nationalized its natural resources, including oil. But the country's prosperity was upended by the 2011 NATO-led bombardment and the ensuing destruction, factional violence, and competing governments. The US and Western media had to smear Gaddafi as a monster because the prosperity he delivered to Libya back then was threatening to go continental. Because why would the US turn down $1 billion that would have helped disenfranchise black people, if not intentionally to prevent the elevation of our people?
Stabilize that government. Well, what about Libya? See, how much money is being spent to arm the so-called rebels? They're dissatisfied. Well, what is their dissatisfaction about? Do they have jobs? Yes. Do they have food? Yes. Has Gaddafi used the oil money to build Libya? Yes. Did Gaddafi use oil money and discover water under the Sahara Desert and brought that water to the surface and brought water from Benghazi all the way to the border almost of Tunisia? Did he impose farming in the desert so that they could feed their own people? Yes. Are there billions of dollars that he's spending building homes, building apartments for his people?
Now, what I find especially frustrating is that many Black Americans still don't even know this history. Many are still unaware of how much Gaddafi wanted to help and how much he tried to actually intervene for the betterment of our people. And yet, most people's knowledge of Gaddafi comes from the smear campaign that was led by the Western media and governments. And I mean, they don't know the man who said, and I quote, "Africa needs to be independent. We need to stop relying on the West and start building our own future." And the US saw Gaddafi as a threat. Now that's just clear, right? Because he understood the power of Pan-African unity. He knew that African nations could rise if they didn't rely on the West. And he wanted Black Americans to be part of that rise. But America, as usual, wasn't interested in true freedom for Black people, and they wanted control. They didn't care about the well-being of Black Americans when they could actually use them as a pawn in their geopolitical game. And I believe we need to talk about this more. We need to share this history because it's a part of a larger narrative of how the West has historically tried to undermine any attempts at true Black empowerment. And the truth is, most Black Americans have no idea about this, because how many of you actually knew that Gaddafi tried to give $1 billion to Black Americans and it was blocked? How many of you knew that a man who had been vilified as a terrorist was actually trying to uplift the very community that has suffered at the hands of the same powers that destroyed him? Because this is a kind of history that's conveniently erased and twisted and buried, but we can't let it be forgotten. We need to understand the stakes here. The US didn't block the donation because they cared about terrorism. They blocked it because Gaddafi was challenging their monopoly over the global order. And they will do anything, we know already, to make sure that we never have the resources, the power, or the unity to rise above it. So the next time someone talks about Gaddafi, don't just take the media's word for it. Ask the deeper questions. Ask why the West hated him so much, and ask why they went to such extreme lengths to actually destroy his government and to destroy Libya and to block $1 billion offer to help Black Americans. Because the real enemy here is not Gaddafi. The real enemy is the system that blocks Black progress at every turn, all while pretending to be our savior, by the way. So this is why we need to wake up. We need to educate ourselves and make sure that we know our true history, because the powers that be have been working tirelessly to keep us divided, to keep us disempowered, and to keep us uninformed. And that's exactly why we need to take our history back, understand it fully, and use it to actually fuel our fight for justice and equality. What are your thoughts on this? Please, let's continue the conversation in the comment section. I really want to hear what your opinion is on this. And while you're at it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. That's it from